Good evening and welcome to Burnsville Park and Natural Resource Commission meeting, April 6th, 2015. First part of our agenda is approval of agenda for tonight's meeting. Commissioner, is there anything would you like to add to the agenda? Staff? Would like to have a motion to approve today's agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And motion approves. Second part is citizens' comments. Anybody who would like to come over? Seeing none, we are going to move to approval of minutes for March 2nd, 2015. Commissioners, anything that you like to add or everything looks okay on this? Okay, looks good. Staff? I'd like to have a motion to approve March 2015's minutes.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And motion carries. The fourth one is to review and make a recommendation for adding a splash pad in Cliff Fen Park adjacent to Burnsville Lions Club playground. And presenter will be Garrett Back, Recreation and Facility Manager, City of Burnsville.
Good evening, Chair Raouf and Commissioners. I'm very excited to be here tonight to have the opportunity to talk to you about a proposal that would add a splash pad adjacent to the Burnsville Lions Playground in Cliff End Park. As part of the introduction this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about what a splash pad is, why Cliff End is an excellent location for this amenity in Burnsville. We'll provide you with an overhead to see how a splash pad can fit in nicely into Cliff End Park. Talk a little bit about the budget process and the guiding principles that went into creating the design that you'll see this evening. And then I'll walk through the design and talk about the different features that we have in the design. When I'm done with that, I'm going to invite Jeff Cornea of Commercial Recreation Specialists up here, and he's going to kind of talk about the technical aspect of how a splash pad operates, the quality of the equipment, things like that. At the conclusion, we'll have an opportunity for questions, and then we also have some special guests out in the audience this evening that I'd like to recognize. All right, we'll start with what is a splash pad. According to the state of Minnesota, a splash pad is a zero-depth pool. It has no standing water, and as a result of that, it requires no lifeguards, no supervision by the owner. Because of these features, owning and operating a splash pad makes it's a significantly less cost for an owner to operate something like this as compared to a pool itself. The site selection. So Cliff End Park, many of you may remember, we were here a few years ago to talk about putting in Burnsville Lions Playground. The playground itself has been a popular destination playground for us for over 20 years. And then in 2012, we partnered with the Burnsville Lions Club, and they allowed us to renovate that project, and it continues to be just a very highly used playground with a lot of great features in it. During that process, when we were renovating the playground, we had some dialogue with the Burnsville Lions Club, and they were very interested in partnering with us again to add a splash pad as a phase 2 part of that project. In addition to that, there's a lot of great amenities in the park. We have shelters and shade nearby the playground. It's close to an existing water line, the location that we're looking at, which helps with the cost of putting it in. It's very close to a rain garden, which Jeff will talk about later on why that's important. And then it's visible from both the parking lot and the road, which will help us with allowing people to identify that that's just another great feature in one of our parks. What you see here on the screen is an overview of what that the splash pad would look like if we put it into the location that we've identified. The large brown and green oval there is the Burnsville Lions playground that it currently exists in the park. The large green, the three structures there are our shelters, and we're proposing that the splash pad go in between there. Our water line, there's a sidewalk that kind of runs off the parking lot and some dark structures down to the bottom left. Our water line runs in from that area. And then just off to the left in the bottom corner, you see the green half circle there. That's where our rain garden is. So between the playground and the shelters and the location of the water line, this is just kind of an ideal place to put it into the park. A little bit about the budgeting process and how we created the design. So the Burnsville Lions Club a few years ago donated $70,000 towards this project. The city had last year put in an additional $70,000 in matching funds to give us a total budget of $140,000 for the project. Like we did with the Burnsville Lions Playground, we wanted to go with natural themes because of what Cliff End Park is all about and natural colors. And also similar to that playground, we wanted to have a feature that was all ages that would serve toddlers, youth, teens, and cater to families. There'll be both ground and overhead features in this, and Jeff and I, throughout the rest of the presentation, will talk about how some of those features, how we can expand the park if we decide to do so down the road, or that there's some interchangeable features that can go in and out of the park. This slide kind of gives you an idea of the proposed layout and the features that would be in the splash pad. I'll kind of walk you through some of the different features here. So if you see the arrow here, this whole mini oval or circle is kind of the toddler area. We have some interactive spray fountains if the kids wish to cover up some of the spray fountains and whatnot. It causes some of the other ones to shoot a little higher or interact differently. On the back side of that, which is a little hard to see, but it's right where the arrow is now, there's a little frog that kind of sprays water out of its mouth, and the toddlers can turn it and aim it in different directions and whatnot. This feature it's just a really neat little feature that it creates a water dome essentially when it's running. And so kids can go in and out of it. Often they like to go inside of it, and they can actually be mostly dry if they're inside the water dome. So it just creates some different experiences and feelings and whatnot that are neat with the water play. We've intentionally divided the toddler zone from the higher, more active and older age groups, which is where most of your 5 to 12 and beyond individuals will choose to hang out with what is kind of the family zone right here. So that's a pretty common layout where the overhead features kind of tend to be where families, moms and dads, grandparents tend to hang out with their children. And so in this section, what you see in the family zone is one of our overhead features. That feature actually has a dumping bucket on there, which again is a pretty popular feature where the youth will kind of wait for the timing of the bucket to fill up before it dumps, and then it becomes kind of a game where they'll try to run and get under it and either not get wet, or if they're looking to get wet, get there at the right time. Right in the middle, you see two spray features right there. Those are both set up that in the future, if funding becomes available and the interest is there, we can actually add 2 additional spray features or overhead features into those areas. And you can kind of see where the current one is. They basically just pop the cap off and insert whatever feature we choose to add into that space. So it's kind of set up for the ability to expand in that way in the future if we wish. As we move around the outside into the more active areas, this is kind of a series of ground sprays that will, again, change in height and whatnot as kids step on them and bounce around on them and things like that. Moving around the outside, we've got a couple water cannons, which again are always popular features where kids can twist them and turn them and try to get their friends or parents or whoever wet that is standing nearby. And then our last feature over here is kind of a spray tunnel, which again is for kids with those features, it's popular that they'll try to run through them and not get wet, or if they're looking to get wet, obviously run right through the middle of it. That's most of the features of the actual splash pad design. Next, I'd like to invite up Jeff Cornea. As I mentioned, he's with Commercial Recreation Specialists, and he's the project manager that we're working with on this particular project.
Thank you, Garrett. My role here tonight, and thank you, members of the commission, for allowing me to come up, is primarily to educate, answer questions, inform, clarify any things that you may have, questions you may have for me. A splash pad, if it's your first splash pad, can seem a little overwhelming, and just some of the questions you might have, or some of the questions you may not even know what to ask yet. So what I'd like to do is I have 5 or 6 different areas I'd like to cover. Maybe start a little bit about who we are, just briefly touch on commercial recreation so you know who you're working with and why you're working with us. Talk about a little more technical detail about the design intent, why we designed the splash pad like we did. And then maybe talk a little bit about the product itself. Why would you want to partner with us and look at the company that we partner with. So our organization is Commercial Recreation Specialists, based out of Madison, Wisconsin. Have been providing splash pads in the upper Midwest for 15 years. We've installed over 100 splash pads in this area. The manufacturer that we associate with is Vortex Aquatic Structures. They're the largest in the world, a provider of manufacturing splash pad. They have over 6,000 installations across the globe, 5,000 here in the U.S. We use a factory certified installers to do all of our installation that manufacturers in Canada. They're flown up there. They're trained on how to put it in. And then we use installers here in this region here. If you look at the equipment and you look at the experience we have, the manufacturer's been doing this for 20 years. We provide, I would say, probably 90% of the splash pads, municipal splash pads in Minnesota and Wisconsin. I know in the 7-county metro area last year, there were 4 major installations, and we did all 4 of them. So that's generally because landscape architects or the customers specify the product because of some of the quality that I'll talk a little bit about later. The design intent when we started this project, typically when you look at a splash pad, it's important to look at the area, what type of an area it is, what type of resources are around it. When you specify that the product itself, are you looking for a natural product, bright primary colors? It's a lot of things to look at. Even more important is the age group and how you define that splash pad. If you've ever been on one, I'm a father of 6 children and they're all splash pad age. And if you've got the toddlers into an area and they run across and you've got a teenager run across and knocking them down, it's important to keep those areas segregated as much as you possibly can given the space that you have to work with. It's also important to look at the water effects that you're putting out there, so you're not putting high pressure, high flow areas where the toddlers or infants are going to be sitting and having that blasting up into their face. So splash pad is really a multi-generational play. So you will have infants out there that are sitting with their hands in the water spray, and it's a safe type of water for them. Up to a toddler age, as Garrett had talked about, that little frog that you can rotate, it's about 18, 19 inches high, so it's at their height. The water flow coming out of it is a soft, arching water, so again, it's for that toddler age. The laminar water effect that comes out of that dome is very popular. It truly is a sheet of water that comes out. Kids love to put their hands in it and sit under it and socialize underneath it. So we try to look at things that are geared towards that age group and put that in the toddler area. The teens, elementary kids, what do they want? They want to compete and they want to interact with each other and work in teams. So there's a team spray where you can get as many kids as you can standing on it, plugging up the different apertures on there, and it'll shoot water in the end up to 15 feet in the air, depending on how you pressurize it. So the more kids that can get as a team, the higher you can get that water to go. The cannons are good from a competitive standpoint. Kids love to spray each other and see who can last the longest before they jump off. So there's reasons that we look at this. The water tunnel, you can achieve that through a stainless tube, a series of stainless tubes, but in this case, we did it with water jets shooting up and making a tunnel. That's important because looking at a splash pads are inclusive by design. You know, we also do commercial playgrounds as well. Commercial playgrounds are not necessarily inclusive by design. You have to be thinking about surfacing, you have to be thinking about fall heights, how kids are going to transfer onto that station, you know, from a wheelchair and such. By default, a splash pad is that. Whether you're in a walking device or a wheelchair, you can go across the entire facility and interact with everything. So naturally, that's just very important. Talking a little bit about the technology behind the timer, because you might be wondering, does this thing run nonstop from morning till night? Some of the questions. It works on a timer. So as the owner, you set the hours of operation. It could be from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. What happens is the children come up to the pad during the hours of operation. There's an activator on the main drain. They step on it. It activates the splash pad. It fires up the water. The solenoid's open. The water shoots out. It runs for 4 minutes at a time. At the end of that 4-minute sequence, it then shuts down until someone runs over, hits that activator again, starts up, and it runs for 4 minutes. That's a good water conservation strategy because that water is only running for 4 minutes at a time as long as someone is at the park. So, and again, that timer can be set whatever you want. You can set those on and off times. So if someone is there, let's say before 9 a.m. or after 9 p.m., the activator basically is disabled. So it doesn't function and the computer doesn't talk to it. You know, in talking about that water conservation strategy, it's very fortunate that you happen to have a rain garden right near to that park because, you know, many communities don't have that. And what they'll do is they'll run that water down to the sanitary sewer and pay the sanitary rates. You have that rain garden. I think that's probably the most sustainable way to do that because as you look at the water, that potable water that you're running down normally would go into the drain system and you'd have to basically treat that. With that rain garden, what a rain garden does is, you know, you have chlorine in your water, your city water, so you want to dechlorinate that water as much as you can before it gets into a watershed or a natural environment. With that rain garden, we're going to daylight, we're going to exit out that water from the splash pad into the rain garden. It's going to filter through the rain garden. You want as much as you can to percolate into the soil, let the ground be the natural filter of that water, and then return back to the water table. Anything that's left at the end of that run would then go down into the water, into that natural waterway area there. During the summer, you want that sun to get exposure to the water so that it can dechlorinate that water, so that's important. So you really have the most sustainable splash pad you can by taking that water and putting it back into the environment, and not treating it. You know, some people ask just the amount of water a splash pad uses. This design is about 20,000 gallons a day because it's rated at a maximum of about 26,000 gallons a day. That's if somebody was at that pad every 4 minutes hitting that activator all day long. Well, that's not the case. So you're probably looking at about 20,000 gallons a day average. 1 acre of grass to do 1 inch of rainfall is 27,000 gallons. This is a comparison. It kind of helps understanding. A softball field, 1 inch of water is 18,000 gallons. A youth soccer field, 1 inch of water is 22,000 gallons. So it gives you kind of a measurement or something, a stick to look at and say, how does this compare to other recreational facilities and amenities if people have concerns about the use of the water and where that water is going. Maintenance is another big concern. A splash pad, you might be thinking, you know, how much maintenance is involved? What is that going to be ongoing? Because you have what's called a flow-through type of splash pad, it's not a recirculating. You don't need a certified pool operator or aquatic facility operator. You don't have to be checking the water daily. You don't have restrooms. You don't have a lifeguard, all the things that come with that. It's really a standalone splash pad that's run on a controller. Your daily maintenance is going to be showing up in the morning, probably blowing off the leaves, you know, from the trees around it and emptying the trash. That's it. That'll be your only maintenance you have. Otherwise, you pretty much set the system and you let it operate on its own. The only other times you'll do maintenance on it will be in the fall. So winter time's coming up, maybe in a normal irrigation system, you might blow the water out of the system. This is a gravity-fed system. What that means is your splash pad is here, your drain is down here. At the end of the season, you open up the valves, the water flows back at that 2% slope back to the drain and drains out of the system. So there's no water in the lines. So when winter comes, you don't have the opportunity for anything to freeze in there. You leave those open. There are brass caps on the embeds in the concrete. You take those off, you put a winter cap on, which is solid, doesn't have the holes in it, so the rain and snow and things can't melt and get down in there. That's it. That's all you do in the fall. In the spring, you change the caps back out to your normal spray caps. You turn on the city water, you flush the system through once, and then you set it, and it's running again for a season. So that's the only maintenance you have for this type of a splash pad. So it's very, very low. Looking at the features in the product, all of the product is 100% stainless steel. So if you look at all the embedded features that get mounted down into the concrete, those are all stainless steel. The nozzles that go on those are a lead-free brass. They're not plastic. There's no plastic anywhere in the system. All of the elevated features are a stainless. Any plastic that you see on there is an impact-resistant plastic. I've shown Garrett and Terry some videos where they've taken that plastic and mounted it and taken a steel pipe to it and hit it for a good 3 or 4 minutes and deform it, and you can't do anything, it pops back. So it's pretty much indestructible. It's not going to shatter, it's not going to crack. So very high quality. It's vandal resistant, the most vandal resistant you can get on a splash pad hardware. This is, as Garrett was talking about, we included a couple different, we call them a safe swap mount. It's a large stainless mount that gets embedded in the concrete. Normally you would have some elevated feature, and then you have a boot that goes on that. It's a toe guard, so kids' toes aren't hitting the pipe and the bolts and things on here. It bolts on with 4 bolts. So in phase 1, let's say, you're investing all your money into the concrete and into the infrastructure of it, but at a later date, you might want to add more elevated features, or maybe you want to add a second splash pad in another park, and you may want to swap some of those features. You're really refreshing that splash pad if you had a multi-splash pad strategy. This is called the interim spray cap. So this is what's going to go on that embedment until you add another elevated feature. It's a machined plastic head, and you can machine on here a variety of different apertures, something that shoots up like this, like a fountain, things that shoot at an angle, a solid stream. So, you're welcome to look at this. I can pass this around, and you can take a look. So it's a very expandable system, and I think that's really important in that you can get something in the ground now so the community can enjoy it, but then at a later date you can add to that, and you have that ability without having to pour more concrete or rip anything up. The infrastructure's in place. They have the longest warranty in the industry. All the stainless is going to be guaranteed for 20 years. So it's going to be similar to your commercial playground equipment. So the equipment you put in now will last the duration of this pad. So, any questions specifically that I can answer?
Mr. Chair.
right, please.
Yes, I have a couple issues. One is the water is not recycled, is that correct?
That's correct. The water is not recycled. Yep.
Okay. The second is, when I looked at the pictures and you see kids running around across there, but I don't see anybody in a wheelchair or any special need kids.
Okay.
How are they going to deal with this with a wheelchair? Could there be an access so the wheelchair can come out? Because obviously around the edges of the splash pad, it's going to be soggy.
Yeah, so, okay, very good question, actually. And I don't know if the graphic might explain it best that we had that top down, or even this one right here. So as you look at this visual here, what we naturally incorporate is what's called a 5-foot dry zone around this. So you can kind of see that dry area going around the splash pad where the water hasn't sprayed. That's a 5-foot dry zone. So that's really your area for folks to walk on without getting wet. If people wanted to bring their wheelchairs around that area. So what's not going to happen is the water is not going to extend beyond the concrete into the grass. You won't get ponding and puddles, and you won't have a muddy mess around the splash pad. That's part of the design intent. That's a great question. The splash pad itself will be flush with final grade. I mean, as much as it can, that concrete will be flush with the grass. There is a concrete path that comes from the drinking fountain to the splash pad and then on to the shelters in the back. So that's a natural ADA access right into the concrete. So to answer that question, if that answered it properly.
Just one last.
Yeah.
We see pictures of kids running.
Yeah.
To me, that's not a real safe thing, especially where we have young kids and other kids. Is there at least put a sign up that says no running?
Yeah, I would highly recommend, and I can help the city with the typical sign that you would put up that gives the hours of operations and other types of things. It could be dealing with diapers and lots of other things, the things you can't think of that happen to a typical municipality. So I would highly recommend a sign of some sort put up there. And as far as the AD access here, everything here is reachable on a chair. So if you look at some of those water loops, those spray cannons, those are all set at a height for a typical child to use, but also if you're in a chair to come up and interact with it as well. All of the ground effects, like that tunnel there, they can either go into the water or under the water based on the arch of it. So, and this is a rough brushed broom concrete. So the concrete is a rough brush, broom finish to it. So it's a non-slip surface. With splash pads, they fall under the Minnesota Department of Health pool code. There is no ASTM or Consumer Product Safety Commission, regulation like there are commercial playgrounds for fall safety surfacing. And so a brush finish is what we put on there. It's a non-slip finish. From a risk standpoint, you can put the sign out there and say no running. Kids will run, but they will be safe with that type of finish.
My last one is the chlorination of the water coming out. Where is that? How does that work?
Yeah, so the chlorine itself that's in the water, as it goes into the rain garden, that will go, as much water as possible will be percolated into the soil.
Where is the chlorination coming into the system here?
Oh, where's the chlorine coming in?
Yeah.
From the city, if you guys have any chlorine in your water, from the city. Potable water. Yep. Go ahead, please.
What hours of operation is the city considering?
We haven't finalized what those exact details are going to be on that. It's something that the group will still need to discuss and whatnot. Our parks are from sun up till 10 p.m. We won't have them operating during that entire time, but it's something that still needs to be discussed.
What about days where it's like raining out? Is it still going to be able to be operational?
Yeah, once we get the computer set up with the hours of operation, it'd be like any of our parks. I mean, if people want to go down and use Burnsville Lions Playground right now in the rain and whatnot, they can. The splash pad would still be operational if it was hot and raining and someone felt like going over and turning it on, they probably would. I would imagine, like most of our parks, during times when the weather's inclement, the use is pretty minimal. So somebody might push the button once during a rainstorm, but it probably wouldn't be running very often.
So just to make sure I understand, on days it's raining, the water would only come out if someone's there hitting the button.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because the system has to be activated, so there's a computer that kind of runs the solenoids, that basically, when you hit the little sensor in the drain, it sends a signal back to the computer and says, okay, someone's here, turn it on. It opens up all the valves of water. The natural city water pressure, 40, 50 PSI, forces that water through the system and out. There's no pumps, so there's no active moving pumps in the system. The computer then keeps it open for 4 minutes. At the end of 4 minutes, it goes ahead and sends the signal back to the solenoids on the manifold and says, turn everything off. It shuts all the water off to each of the lines. And it keeps that pressure from getting to the pad, and it shuts it off until someone's out there again and hits that activator. That's correct.
Okay.
What is your estimate for maximum number of people using this at a single time?
I would say this size pad here is probably about 35 to 40.
This is a pretty heavily used park. Do we feel like that's big enough?
When we were looking at putting a splash pad in at Cliff End, I don't think the idea was to, I think the current Burnsville Lions Playground can accommodate about 250 people at one time. The goal wasn't necessarily this was more of it's a feature that is available in the park. Just like our shelters can accommodate so many people in the shelter, the splash pad is a feature. We would anticipate that people would use it just like they would any other parts of the park based on availability and how crowded it is and whatnot.
I just had a
Go ahead,
question
please.
about the wastewater in the rain garden. Is the capacity of the rain garden big enough on like weeks where we get a ton of rain, there isn't gonna be a pooling around there? Or is there a plan B if there is too much water for the rain garden where that water can flush out?
Yeah, that rain garden actually exits out to a wetland area, which is quite large. So that rain garden, if there was, and it does slope in that direction, so that water, that effluent water is actually draining out into a much, much larger area that can handle the capacity, yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
Any other question?
What's the
Well done.
ongoing cost to the city for this after it's installed, so in year 2?
Strictly would be water, the cost of the water, the potable water, what your cost per 1,000 gallons, of water that the city would pay. And then minimal maintenance, which you're probably already doing at the park for visiting the park to empty the trash and blowing it off, and that's really it. That's the daily maintenance, yeah, and the costs incurred.
ahead.
There is, we made, some splash pads are pressure washed. It's about an $800 expense if there's a need to do that on an annual basis, but it would be minimal.
David?
So you mentioned that the equipment and these pieces were going to last the entire life of the splash pad. How long is that projected to last?
We've been installing splash pads, for 15 years, and they're still running because it is stainless material with a super durable powder coat material on it. So, I've been installing playgrounds for many, many years, and I know many of the playgrounds I've sold, have lasted quite long. I mean, I've replaced playgrounds that have lasted 20-plus years. They're really replacing them because of conformance issues, not because the material is structurally degrading and rusting and things of that nature. You won't have that with stainless. It won't rust. So it's going to be more, does the city want to replace an item because they want something new? So you're going to pull off an elevated feature and replace it, with a different feature, and you can do that with this system. The manifold where the city water comes into is a stainless manifold. Really the only replaceable parts in this entire system are the solenoids themselves. It's a professional grade solenoid valve. That's basically a solenoid is the computer sends a signal, it opens up a diaphragm, allows the water to flow through like an irrigation system. Those are really the only replaceable components if one of those should fail. Everything else is stainless and lead-free brass. There's no moving parts. You might have a bearing in the bucket that dumps. Again, that's a brass and Delrin bearing. If that should fail within the first 5 years, that would be replaced, but it's all long-term. So it really isn't anything to wear out on this system. I don't want to say it that way, but because kids aren't playing on this, like they are a commercial playground, the water is coming out and it's a static component that's there. You just got the powder coat finish and you've got a material that is stainless that isn't going to crack. Kids could try to vandalize with a baseball bat. They're not going to do a whole lot of damage to it, scuff the powder coat. Versus if this was a PVC plastic material where they could crack it and damage it, then you've got to take and dig that out. So, there really isn't anything to go wrong or really to degrade in the system.
Markman?
With all the drought conditions in the country and in this area, we all have hours that we can only water our lawns. And yet we're going to say we could keep this open for 9 in the morning to 9 at night. Is that really going to impact on the city in terms of how much water we're going to put out?
Terry.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Nachman, I guess we would look at this as a pool amenity, similar to our water features in Nicollet Commons Park. So we haven't typically reacted to drought conditions for our recreational complex. We certainly would have that option if we chose to do so. We could simply deactivate the system and not have it operate during the peak times where you would have evaporation. But going into it, we wouldn't expect that we would do that.
I just have one more question. Same
Go ahead,
question.
Anna.
The rain garden, again, will there be standing water in it that we have to worry about children playing in it, falling in it?
Commissioner Arnold, the rainwater garden is set to, it accepts a certain volume of water, and then there's an overflow that it naturally flows into the wetland complex. So after any given rain event, we may likely have standing water in that rainwater garden for a period of 12 to 20 hours, and it'll be a similar situation. Obviously, that'll happen more often now, but a lot of it's going to depend on how much use the facility's getting, but you will have standing water for longer periods of time. We have not experienced a problem with children going down into that area. It's very well vegetated around the perimeter, and it's not very inviting for people to go into.
How far away is it from the splash pad?
It is probably 30 yards to the west, southwest a little bit.
It's a long, narrow trough that you can kind of see runs along out into a much larger area, yeah.
And then the second question was, I guess I'm a little surprised the water isn't treated, and it's just because there's no stagnant water. I just keep thinking of that outbreak from the Minnesota Zoo when the kids were playing in the pond. And I know there was a pool there, so that must be
Yeah,
the
that's
reason.
the key is that there's no stagnant water. As a matter of fact, you know, Minnesota Department of Health, you know, as long as it's a flow through, the only time they'll be out is just a final inspection. And what they do, Steve Clem, who works with the state, he inspects all pools in the state of Minnesota. He'll come out, we'll fire up the system for about 20 minutes, turn it off, let the water drain, wait a half hour, and then he inspects to make sure there is no standing water in the concrete. The concrete is sloped to the drain properly. There's no areas for algae to form, for kids to slip, for the water to sit, because that's their main concern as well. And so, yeah, that's what we have the experience with, so that won't be an issue. Yeah.
Stacy?
Are we planning some extra facilities at this park now? If we're going to expand again, we can expect more crowds and more visitors. I know last couple of years, it's been a difficult upkeep and keeping up with all the facilities.
Commissioner Johnston, you asked earlier, I believe, about the size of the splash pad, and I think the size in this amenity really kind of maxes out this park in terms of the parking that we have available, and we have limited opportunities to expand the parking. I think there's adequate parking. I'm not concerned about that. But to make a much larger splash pad or to add another amenity to that park, I would not recommend that as a staff person. But I think this kind of meets the master plan for the park that we had in mind when we pulled that together a couple years ago.
I guess I'm asking about restrooms, and are we going to bring in more?
The one, we had to bring in, I believe we went, Mr. Ryan will correct me, from 2 to 3 units down there when we actually built the playground. I think that will still handle the number of people. Again, this is really kind of about adding a few more people, 35 people, but overall, you know, it's not adding a lot of people to the park. So I think the number of restrooms we have is adequate. I think down the road, as staff, we would like to look at a little bit nicer restroom facility. They make waterless units like you would see in a state park, where you still have a tank that accepts the waste, but then it gets pumped. But you can have ventilation and things like that. I do see us as maybe replacing those portable restroom units with something like you might see in a state park.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, going back to Commissioner Nachman's comment, I guess I'm a little concerned about how green it is if people can run it all day. Are there any best practices as to what is the recommendation? Does it save more water to have people be able to run it all day because then they're not using water at home if they're really hot in their yard? Or, I don't know, what has been looked at there?
We look at it as another amenity for children to use in the community. Yes, there's some water used, just as there is to maintain a soccer field or a softball field. That's why, Mr. Corney, I kind of gave you that number so you could relate to what it takes to maintain a soccer field so our youth can play soccer. And we have a similar situation at Nicollet Commons Park with the water features. We go through a lot of water at that facility just from evaporation.
Okay.
So you really have to look at it like any other municipal pool, and that it's really kind of a cost to providing that amenity for our community. Having said that, I think we are doing it in an as environmentally a sensitive way as we can. In that we've got push button activation, and we are then using the water to go into the natural environment to really supplement the water in the wetland complex.
Any other questions? I have a few questions. Number one, having this experience with this kind of things, if there is a diaper accident, what happens? So the city, there's nobody there to monitor this and clean it, or how are we going to deal with that?
You know, I can say from my personal experience, it's usually been a phone call by the parents calling the city, saying, hey, we've got an issue out here. Someone runs down there and has to clean that up.
Okay? Because there is no running water, that's what I'm saying, the water does not stay and it.
Right, exactly.
Right, so-
Exactly. So once that activator is turned off, the water drains probably within 5 to 6 minutes. On a sunny day, dries up just like that. Probably within 10 minutes, the whole pad is completely dry on an 85, 90-degree day. So you're not going to have standing water with a diaper, and it's not going to be an issue. So you'll generally have the parents calling the city and say, hey, I'm out at the park. You got a problem here, type of thing, so.
And just talking like that, so same thing that happens, I'm making an assumption here, that same thing can happen also in Nicholas Common Park, where city folks has to go in and clean it. Am I making the right assumption?
That's correct.
Okay. The second question I have is, how much does it cost for this, one of the tall features?
Yeah, the tall feature, like a leaf, maybe we can go back to the 3D here. Like this dumping bucket here, it's kind of a dumping bucket and a leaf. That's about $7,000. So you'll find your average elevated piece anywhere from about $5,000 to about $8,000,
Okay.
depending on how many different sprays come off of it and how complex it is. But that's going to put you right in that range.
Okay. And if I understood it right or heard it correctly, there is a plan to add another feature in the future.
I wouldn't want to say exactly there is a plan. We designed it with the opportunity to add a feature in the future if there's funding available and an interest by the community or any of our partners or whatever to do something like that. So instead of just putting in a standard ground feature that had no opportunity for expansion, we chose one that would have that opportunity and placed it in such a way that it would allow for that if there was an interest to do so.
Sounds good. Thank you. Any other questions, commissioners? Thank you very much for your presentation. So we don't have any questions. It's time for us to make a, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, real quickly, I just wanted to, we have some members in the audience here this evening that I would like to recognize. Bill Johnson from the Burnsville Lions Club has been an instrumental member in helping us with both Burnsville Lions Playground and the splash pad. He's been part of the design team all along. He's also allowed us, as a group, we went to one of the Burnsville Lions Club's meetings and made a similar presentation as this one this evening. The Lions Club received that presentation and they unanimously approved us moving forward with this design and whatnot. So I just want to recognize Bill and the rest of the Lions Club for really, over the last several years, making a difference in our community in a positive way for our youth and families.
Thank you very much. Is there a way we can camera it so people can see and recognize and appreciate it? I'm not sure if we have a way of doing it, but it's fine. Thank you very much, guys. Just
you.
wanted to appreciate your time and effort going into it. We all appreciate that. Thank you.
And so with that, I would welcome a motion to proceed with this project.
Motion to proceed.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
And motion moves. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Next, we are going to move on updates on the Emerald Ash Borer management. And presenting is Dale. I apologize. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Just have a quick update for you on the Emerald Ash Borer plan. I know that this plan was brought before the Commission in 2013 when it was originally developed. And so some of you may be familiar with that process. There might be some folks on the Commission who weren't on at that time. And so I'll give a little bit of history on what Emerald Ash Borer is and why we have a plan for it, and give an update on kind of its current status and also where we are in the implementation of that plan. So Emerald Ash Borer, it's a metallic green beetle, pretty small, about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch in length. There's a couple photos there to kind of give you an example of what it looks like. Whoops, that didn't work. So what the beetle does is it finds an ash tree, lays its eggs, and the larvae essentially feed underneath the bark. And so the picture you're seeing there is a piece of the bark's been torn away, and you can see those galleries. It's one of the telltale signs that a tree's been infested with emerald ash borer. The larvae feed on that as they go back and forth. They leave that trail on the tree, and one of the reasons we've kind of seen I don't know if you call it a slow spread, but it's been around the metro area for a while. There have been some new infestations located, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see after a tree does become infested, it does take a while to see the symptoms from that infestation. So you can see year 1, the tree looks pretty healthy. Year 2, you can tell maybe something is going on. And then years 3 and 4 are when you generally see the heavy damage or more noticeable impact to the tree. And so an infestation can be in place for quite a while before it would get noticed. And you can imagine, these particular cases are on boulevard trees, so they're kind of out in the open. But if you had an infestation in a more wooded, natural area, and you had generally the beetles stick to one tree or they don't move a great distance in the beginning of the infestation, it might be hard to find this when it's surrounded by hundreds of other trees. And so generally you might need more trees to start showing these symptoms before it would be found. So it can take a while before an infestation would be known. This map is a little bit hard to see, but you can see you've got the Minnesota River here. This is Burnsville, Black Dog Lake. 2 fairly new infestations that were found is there's a dot right here. This is in Bloomington, obviously just north of Burnsville. And then the newest one is this location here in Lebanon Hills Park on the border of Apple Valley and Egan. And you can see the Burnsville border kind of runs down, from where Black Dog Lake is. And so both those infestations, are within, a few miles of the Burnsville border. And so, as we're looking at our plan and as we're kind of making plans for the future, we can expect that, emerald ash borer may potentially be in the city now and it hasn't been found yet. I think that Lebanon Hills one, when they found it, they anticipated that the beetle had probably been there for 4 years before they actually found that infestation. So it is nearby. It's getting close, and it's something that we need to prepare for. Because of that finding in Lebanon Hills Park, Dakota County is now in the quarantine area. So the Department of Agriculture, once you have a known infestation, they put that quarantine on essentially for the movement of wood, ash wood. So you can't take, basically like firewood, any logs of ash trees or branches, they can't be transported outside of that quarantine area without being chipped up. So if you have it chipped on site down to about a 1 inch by 1 inch size, then in those instances, it can be transported outside of the quarantine area. I think they determine at that size there isn't enough material for the beetle or the larvae to live on. They do still recommend that you have it covered, and obviously they encourage you to keep all that ash material inside the quarantine county. But if you do have the need to move it out, you can do it as chipped wood, but not as the logs. And so that's obviously important for our tree removal efforts, that our contractors are aware that we're in the quarantine area now, and also just for the general public as they have camping trips or a tree in their yard that gets cut down or different things that they can't transport that material either. And so now on to kind of our specific EAB plan and its implementation. Last year in 2014, we treated 478 high-quality public ash trees. And so it's a chemical treatment that potentially would kill any larvae that were in the tree, but also provides, I think the chemical we use provides 2 years of protection so that it won't get an infestation in that tree. And so, we determined that through a tree survey that was done, and we rated all the trees on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the healthiest. And so we pick out those healthier trees to try and protect. Also, there was a few ash trees removed last year, but not a significant amount. Compared to this year in 2015, we've got a contract in place to remove 104 poor quality boulevard ash trees. And also through our street reconstruction project, I think there's about another 50 ash trees that are going to be removed through that. And so we've got about 154 total that we'll take out of the poor quality ash trees. And the plan does lay that out, some removals over each year and then also the chemical treatments. So for this year, the number of trees we're going to chemically treat is up to 935. And so we'll be getting prices on that, and generally the treatments occur in June. And then just looking 1 year ahead, we've got 1,432 ash trees scheduled for chemical treatment, and then that will essentially be every year. There'll be 1,400 or so every year. So we've got 2,800 trees in total that we're trying to protect, but since the treatments last for 2 years, you do 1,400 1 year, 1,400 the next year, and you kind of rotate that. And then the plan calls for that strategy to kind of be reevaluated, I think, in 2018, 2019, to see if, maybe we want to continue that treatment, or maybe it's time for more removals, see if the infestation, if there's been any in Burnsville, what's happening essentially with the emerald ash borer at that point. And then also next year, there is a larger removal planned for 290 poor quality boulevard ash trees to be removed in 2016. Overall, the plan calls for, I think, about 1,100 ash trees to be removed. And the goal is with those chemical treatments that you would do them long enough to kind of space out those potential removals so that you didn't have a case where if the infestation came to Burnsville and hit hard, you wouldn't have, 1,400 trees or something that would become a hazard and be dying at the same time. And so the treatments kind of space that out. Then we'll reevaluate it and see if we want to keep, treating all those trees, or maybe some of them then do become into poor quality and we can cut that back, and there'll have to be some more removals and less treatments, but that is a few years down the road before we kind of evaluate that again. And I also want to point out with the chemical treatments that the city does, we also get a price for the residents of Burnsville. And so if a resident had a tree in their yard, a private tree that they wanted to chemically treat and protect, they could use the same contractor that the city has hired, and there would be kind of a price guaranteed for those trees that they could use, and hopefully get a better price since we have such a large number that we're treating. So that will be available for the public, and once we get those prices and get a contractor hired, we'll get that information out through the Burnsville Bulletin and the city website, if folks want to take advantage of that. And then before we go to questions, I did bring a couple vials that have the emerald ash borer bug in it. Some of you may have seen them, but I'll pass it around quick. And then I also have the city forester here, Dave Gromish, to help answer questions.
I like to see it.
All right, thank you.
So,
Commissioners, questions, please?
Why do you remove the trees? Is it just because of the threat of the emerald ash borer, or are there other reasons as well?
When we did our inventory system, we rated our trees in poor condition to high condition. The poor condition trees are ones with missing branches, split, cracked, rotting, could be a potential hazard
Okay.
to the streets and so forth.
Are all of them gonna would all of them be infested of the ones that you're cutting down? Is there a percentage of trees that do survive?
Not without the treatment. The treatment is the crucial thing. If you don't treat, the bug will just hopscotch right down. It'll take healthy, stress trees, it's non-selective. It'll take small trees, large trees, and just keep going down. So with our plan, we've decided to take the more stressful trees out first and protect the healthy trees, and eventually down the line, based on pricing costs and what's out there, hopefully try to save some of our greater quality trees, and we're doing that in the park system. We think most of the boulevard trees eventually end up being replaced like they're doing in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Egan, Apple Valley's doing some heavy tree removal right now too. Just
And will we be treating them for the life of the tree then, or is there a,
That'll be a decision we'll have to make in the future here to see. I know the quality trees that are real quality, we have some here at City Hall, we have them in our park systems. Those we'll probably keep and treat for a long time because they're a benefit to the park system. Boulevard trees rotate all the time. We're always losing trees in the boulevard. So we do a constant replacement and work with homeowners on replacement out there.
I was just curious, like if you're getting rid of the dead trees and then you're treating all the live ones, will the infestation decrease, decline over time? Will it move to another city and we don't have to treat as much?
They're experimenting down in, I think, Indiana and Michigan where they've had the biggest hit. And they've been treating some of their greater quality trees down there. And they're thinking by doing that, if they can clear all the ash out miles and miles around them, the ash bug won't come back because there's nothing within 2 to 5 miles.
Okay.
It's not a guarantee. It can be transported. It can ride on a vehicle. It can ride anywhere and be moved around. But they're looking at doing that program. But what they're doing then also is that you can treat a tree that's lost 40% of its canopy and probably bring it back. But 40% is an awful lot on a tree, and it would take a long time. But so you can spread it out, and if there's no bugs in the area and you get all your ash down, you might be able to get 5 years out of a treatment. They're still experimenting with the treatments. Some say you can push it out further if you don't have the bug. We've opted to do the rotation in a few of the cities. I think Egan's doing it every 2 years on their park trees. We're basically one of the only cities in this general area that is treating our boulevard trees. We think they're worth protecting.
Yep.
If you look at like Minneapolis, St. Paul, when the elms went down there was nothing left in the boulevard. We're being selective, so we're taking out the poor, keeping the good, so you don't have a whole city block that's no trees. With that said, with our recon this year, we are going to be taking lots of trees out because of the water main project. We're going to do some before pictures and after pictures, which would kind of give you the idea what Burnsville would look like out without trees. But these trees are some poor quality, but they're also in the way of the road based on how they were planted. So, and they are in our count of our inventory, so it takes our inventory down.
And then just one more question. I love the idea that you're going to allow the citizens to get the deal with the treatment, but how about the cutting down of trees that they think aren't worth saving? Is that something that we will also be offering the citizens, or?
At this point,
does the city cut their own trees?
well, we do, most of the ash tree will be through a contractor. Contractor will be hired to do that work, but at this point, we are not offering any tree removal for private trees.
Stacy?
Are we, what type of chemical treatment are we doing? Active ingredient soil drench?
No, we are
No.
doing injections,
Injections?
trunk injections.
Okay, trunk injections,
Yep.
okay.
It's the safest way to go.
Okay,
On there, you don't get any spillage, and the tree absorbs. We do it in June, and the tree can absorb the chemical, probably within 15 to 20 minutes, because it's in the growing season. We've opted out to do the soil drenched, the soil injections. There is a new spray they're experimenting with trunk bark spray, which is working. But again, you got the drift to consider on there. So we've opted to do strictly the injections into the trunk.
and what's the active ingredient you're using? I can probably guess imidacloprid.
Yeah, might be that one. There's a couple.
Yeah,
of them
there's
out
a
there.
couple, but that's
We're
probably the
using-
most
we're
common.
using triage, and then there's triage, and then there's another company out there with another application of the chemical.
Have you seen any companies promoting more of the pheromone-based? I know they do it with pine beetles, where they put high-strength aggregation pheromone on the pine trees, and it pushes them off the trees. Have you seen?
Heard of that being done on the emerald ash.
Okay, I'm just curious.
I know we're using a wasp, it's a small little wasp they brought in from China. There's 2 kinds, and they're using them to treat some of the areas to kill the bug, and it's working, and the wasps are regenerating. So they'll be introducing, I think, in the Lebanon Hills, the
Okay.
wasps out there, and they might be doing it in Bloomington, so.
Other questions, Stacy?
No, that's it.
Just one more. Is part of the piece of this project to educate the public and the steps for them to go to start treating their own trees?
Yeah, we'll have a public education, kind of ramp up here now that it's been found close. We do have someone on staff who recently went in and redid our website. So if you go to City of Burnsville website under the forestry page, there is a lot of information available there. Also, as I mentioned, there will be information in the bulletin once we get kind of the treatment, numbers and things like that. So there will be a good amount of public education coming out this summer.
Okay, great.
Sounds good. Any other questions, Commissioner? If not, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Next item on our agenda is information presentation for Drinking Water Protection Overlay District. And presenter is Steve Albert, Public Work Director. Thank you, Steve.
One second. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Let me bring this up. I'm before you tonight to give you an informational presentation on our Drinking Water Protection Overlay District. And a couple of people asked me why would we bring this to PNRC? Well, probably the biggest resource we have in the city of Burnsville is our water supply. It's a natural water supply. A lot of the things you were talking about it tonight, we were talking about water infiltration, things like that. So it's a very important topic, and we're going to be doing quite a bit of publicity related to it, and we thought the PNRC would be a great place to kick off kind of our informational presentations that we're going to lead through the city here over the next couple months. So with that, what I'd like to do tonight is take you through kind of a brief presentation on our sources, educate you on what our water supply sources are in Burnsville, what our water uses are in Burnsville, and then talk about why we need this overlay district for protection. Kind of our public schedule. As I said, this is somewhat of a publicity blitz for this, and then answer any questions you might have related to that. First of all, water supply sources. Okay. We have in the city of Burnsville, we're lucky to have somewhat diversified. We have 17 wells in the city of Burnsville. The majority of our wells are north of Burnsville Parkway and north of Highway 13. So we have a string of wells, the majority of which pump from the Jordan Aquifer, which is in the 500 to 600 foot depth below the surface. And then also we have, if you look, this is actually superimposed in its actual location. If you look over to the Kramer Quarry, we have a quarry intake. Now, they refer to that as surface water, but it's really groundwater. What it is it's groundwater that discharges into the bottom of the quarry and that was normally pumped out to the Minnesota River, but we're capturing several million gallons of that today to supplement our water system. So our water system is basically a groundwater system. And one of the things that makes Burnsville unique is because of our bluffs, which are a nice natural feature. However, that bluff we lose, when we go to the bottom of the bluff, we lose this natural layer of protection to the groundwater. When things hit the surface, there's less depth for them to go to our aquifers than there would be if it was at the top of the bluffs. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about this overlay district. Just to give you some statistics, the city of Burnsville pumps over 3.2 billion gallons of water a year. It's a significant amount of water. About 1.1 billion gallons, or a third of that roughly, comes from the quarry intake, and it's mixed. Our water is a mixture of that quarry water, which is in the atmosphere for hours before it's pumped into our system, and then water that never sees the atmosphere. So those are mixed together at our water treatment plant. Another fact also is that the city of Savage, about 80% of their water supply comes from Burnsville. So it isn't just the Burnsville residents and businesses, it's Savage also that's part of our system and that we're responsible for protecting. We have a water use agreement with them. We're in our 6th year. It's been extended for another 5 and 5, meaning they've stepped up for another 5 years and are looking at another 5 beyond that. So we are the primary water supply provider for the city of Savage also. And on a peak day in the summer when it's hot, we will pump 20 million gallons of water in one day. So a significant amount of water comes out of the ground. Why do we need a water supply overlay district? As I mentioned, one of the things that makes us a unique community is our bluffs, but one of the problems with those bluffs are the clay layers and some of the soils that you typically would have built up over the depth of the groundwater aquifers are missing in Burnsville. So if pollutants get into the ground and go straight down in some cases, they can get to our aquifer much quicker than they would in, say, a Lakeville or a community that's got a much thicker area of clay and soils above those bedrock aquifers. And so that's why it's important. The other reason too is if you look at our quarry intake, even though there isn't a lot of surface water that goes in there, there's the potential for a spill or something could get down into there too. So we have to be very diligent about protecting them. And then the other part of it is the state. We would often think that the state of Minnesota would offer protections to us. For the most part, they don't provide protection other than telling us that you need to protect your groundwater. And so that's a problem for us. City ordinances only go so far in their current structure, and the Department of Health, while they regulate many of the larger chemicals and things that companies are using, smaller amounts of chemicals, less than 1,000 gallons, are typically not regulated. A lot of the small businesses have those types of chemicals on site and are using them. So what we're looking to do is supplement the regulations that are out there now. So that's why we're talking about this water supply overlay district. Our proposed district, if you remember where our wells were kind of concentrated along this upper area. And then we've got pretty much the district is everywhere north of 13. And the reason for that is that's that area that we start losing that ground cover. The other reason for that is groundwater in our area naturally flows towards the Minnesota River. So if we have a spill at the bottom of the bluffs, it's not going to come back up to the south, up the hill. It's going to flow towards the Minnesota River or any wells that are between that spill potentially and the Minnesota River. And when you're pumping 3 billion gallons of water a year, you're essentially catching a lot of the things that could get into the groundwater. And so that's why it's important for us to make sure that those things don't get into the groundwater. You've seen in the news the issues they've had around 3M in areas where over time, back in the 50s and 60s, chemicals were dumped on the ground and released, and now they're dealing with cleanups in those communities. And so we don't want to get to that point. We haven't had issues, so we want to be diligent about that. What you see here is an area that most likely, if something was to get onto the ground and pollute in a large amount of it, it could potentially get into our groundwater. And so that's why we've identified this as our overlay district area, and this will be the area that we're concentrating on. The overlay district in this case is very similar to our floodplain ordinance or different overlay districts that we have where you have to meet different requirements. And so that's kind of the model that we're using for this. The overlay district itself, it doesn't change the zoning of a property. If I own a piece of commercial property, it's still commercial. I'm still allowed to have the uses on that property. What it does, though, is we took it, because we're a developed community, it's a little harder for us. Our businesses are already there. We're not a new community where we can say, well, we don't want that kind of business in this wellhead area or that type of business. We already have those businesses. We don't want to take the approach of trying to force businesses out. That's not a good approach for the city of Burnsville. So what we're doing is we're saying if a property redevelops, we'll have what are called performance standards. And what that means is we'll look at the uses they're proposing, and in many cases, most cases, there's not even going to be an issue. They're not probably doing anything that's going to impact the groundwater. We're not concerned about it. But if they are doing something, and it's something that the Department of Health doesn't already regulate or isn't regulated by another agency, we will step in and work with them on what are called performance standards. Maybe some secondary containment. Are you storing it inside? We're not as concerned about things stored inside as we are things that would be stored in a parking lot where it could drain into a storm sewer system. So we'll work with each business and kind of customize a plan with them. But that's, again, for new development. For existing developments, we really want to just work with them to, number one, make sure everybody's aware. If you've got chemicals at your business that you use, you're aware and that you're taking care of those chemicals to make sure we don't have issues. That's going to be our first line of defense. We're going to be doing inspections of the properties that have been identified, and the city, is part of the wellhead plan that we did several years ago. We went through this entire area and identified what are the potential businesses that we want to make sure we stay in touch with them because they might be doing something. It might be a lawn care service that stores a lot of chemicals on site. We want to make sure we're working with them to make sure they've got the proper protections in place, help them get grants, inform them of that. So that's going to be our approach with those existing businesses, is to really reach out to them, work with them, educate them. I don't think anybody would be surprised, but most people don't want to pollute the groundwater. That's a bad thing. Anyone who's polluted the groundwater would tell you it's very expensive if you're responsible for polluting the groundwater, because then you do come under MPCA regulation, and its cleanup is not easy once something gets into the groundwater. So what we find is most businesses are really willing to work with us on that. So that's going to be the approach we take with those businesses in this overlay district. So again, kind of a two-pronged approach. New developments, let's try to be good on the front end, design things that work. We're not prohibiting anybody. We just want to be educated on what's there. Existing developments, make sure we identify any that could be a problem, work with them to make sure there aren't problems related to their use. Schedule-wise, we're here tonight. This is kind of our kickoff at the PNRC. On April 16th, we've actually mailed notice to all the businesses and property owners in that area. We'll be having a informational meeting here at City Hall on the 16th where we'll make a presentation, a little more detailed. We'll get into the nuts and bolts of the actual ordinance and how it affects different businesses. And like I said, you'd be surprised, they're in that big area. The majority of the big users, you think about, even think about the landfill, they're heavily regulated and monitored. It's the smaller businesses that are kind of what we'd call the tweeners that might have a fuel storage tank on site that's doesn't meet MPCA requirements for secondary containment. Those are the types of businesses we're going to be looking to work for, where they don't really have help from the state. That's part of it too, is the state doesn't have the staff to work with every business, and so we want to try to fill that gap. So that informational meeting will be helpful there. On April 27th, we'll be going to the Planning Commission, and we'll have a public hearing. Again, we'll actually notify everyone again of that public hearing where we'll talk about the ordinance, take input on the actual ordinance itself. And tonight, if you have any questions, I've got some links as to where the ordinance is. I didn't want to present that. It's pretty boring stuff, but if you take a look at the ordinance or you have comments, you can certainly email them to me too. Those can be included in the Planning Commission meeting. Then on the 13th, we're going to go to the EDC and talk economics with our business groups and make sure that they understand what this is. Because the goal is obviously not to impact businesses, but to work with the businesses in Burnsville. And so that'll be the purpose of the EDC meeting. And then tentatively in June, we would be taking this forward to the City Council for consideration at that time. So we're trying to stretch this out a little bit and make sure that we've given adequate time for input with businesses, and if the council needs to take more time, they'll take more time. And so something we want to work through, we want to get input. That's why it's a draft at this point. Like any of these ordinances, there's always little things or peculiarities that come up that you want to try to take care of. So with that, one thing before I take questions, again, if anybody has questions, you can contact me. We've set up an actual web page dedicated to this effort, and it's got copies of the ordinance. The types of substances are regulated. I think that's going to be a question for our public is, what are we talking about? Because a lot, like I said, most businesses, it's not going to be an issue for them. And they'll want to know what type of chemicals are we concerned about. So we've got all that information on the website. And with that, I would take any questions that the board has.
Commissioners?
Quick question. A few years ago, they put a ban on certain kinds of fertilizers. Is that still in place?
Yes, the phosphorus bans are still in place. We're supposed to have no phosphorus fertilizers in this area. The water that we actually produce has phosphates in it as part of the water treatment process, so you don't need phosphorus. Most soil and people have enough. As we said earlier, there's actually chlorine is in our water too, small amounts too, as it's being watered on property. So there's no need for phosphorus in Burnsville.
David?
So you mentioned that every 2 years, these properties would be inspected for compliance. Is there a significant cost associated with that?
There's about $20,000 a year is what the city spends on protecting our water. And we budget that as wellhead protection is what we call it in our line item budget. And it's just really a reality of when we look at what the costs are to communities when the water's been contaminated, while $20,000 is a lot of money, to protect 3 billion gallons of water a year, it's actually a pretty small, no pun intended, drop in the bucket of what we're looking at. So we think it's a good investment. We think this effort, even if we are just getting the word out to people, that's the important part. So yes, we'll be hiring, actually, we don't have the staff in-house, we'll have a consultant. They'll keep the database for us. They'll do the inspections every other year for us. They have people that are experts on these types of chemicals and working with property owners on them. So.
Stacy?
On average right now, how often are our businesses being inspected by state and federal agencies for
unless they are
regulated commission?
regulated, unless under the law they're required to apply for a permit, there's no inspections going on.
So your small business, I mean, oils, everything has to have a permit now. What are we missing?
You'd be surprised. Actually, because we're an agricultural state, most of the statutes in the state are written for small quantity. We'll use 1,000 gallons,
quantity,
but
okay, yep.
700 gallons is roughly the limit. So anything under 700 gallons is rarely regulated in the state of Minnesota. 700 gallons in the world of groundwater contamination is a lot of chemical. So for us, that's what the real gap is. The larger, we're not worried about gas stations and other new, even an implement dealership or somebody who has a tank that's larger than that, because they're required to have containment and inspections. So we're trying to fill that gap for these businesses that are below that or might have what we'd call ancillary uses. The other thing we have is Burnsville has the other unfortunate thing of our wellhead area, that's the most industrialized area of Burnsville. It's been that way since the 50s. So there are uses out there that have probably never seen the regulation or any inspections that they probably were supposed to see. So what we're trying to do is make sure none of those have slipped through the cracks too. So, and we're hopeful. If we don't have anybody out there doing something, that's great. Then we're not going to worry about it. But we do know we have some of those smaller tanks and things that we want to make sure aren't an issue.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Move to the miscellaneous items. Commissioners, do we have any miscellaneous item? Staff?
Commissioners, I wanted to make you aware of the City of Burnsville's annual tree sale scheduled for Saturday, April 25th. It'll be right here across the street from City Hall. And then I also wanted to let you know, or remind you that our next scheduled PNRC meeting is on Monday, May 4th, right here in the chambers.
Thank you. That takes us to our last item, motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second? Say aye. All in favor?
Aye.
And motion moves. Thank you very much for watching Burnsville Natural Resource Commission meeting. Have a good evening.